This weekend's G20 summit in New Delhi, India, concluded with a new member, the African Union, an ambitious plan to create a railway from Europe through the Middle East to India, and an acknowledgement of the atrocities in Ukraine, but no mention of the aggressor. Russia and China signed off on this final agreement to come out of the summit, but Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping were notably absent. Earlier today, I spoke with special correspondent Pavni Mittal, who is in New Delhi covering the G20. So, as I mentioned, there were some announcements about this summit, but on some of the key issues leading into the summit, it seems that there was not nearly as much progress made.
Yes, there was a lot of debate and discussion about what could actually be achieved at the G20, because you have to always remember that these are forums mostly to build consensus, but follow through has been weak. So whether it is on issues like climate change or debt restructuring, there was hope that leaders would come together and agree on those. But even though they have agreed on this, there's very little that countries can do to hold each other accountable. Now, one of the biggest issues that have sort of dominated this forum has been the war in Ukraine. You had Western countries, particularly the G7 nations led by the United States, that had been pushing for stronger language on the war and against Russia. But that was countered, of course, by Russia, supported very strongly by China. And then you had sort of a third bloc led by India, which has tried to play neutral ground.
So, how does President Biden's administration rationalize or justify this statement, which I think by all accounts was weaker than they wished had come out of the summit?
Well, officially, the White House has said that this builds on what the US and other G7 nations and basically most other Western nations have said about the war. But a lot of times, these declarations and this communique often mirrors the language preferred by the host nation. And in that way, this is a reflection of what India's stand has been, that is to call for peace, but also not directly criticize Russia. Ukraine's foreign minister actually took to social media and said, quote, "This is nothing to be proud of," criticizing this joint declaration.
So, on one of the more substantive announcements, there was this rail and shipping corridor announced linking Europe, the Middle East, and in India. Can you tell us a little bit more about that announcement?
So for India, this was a chance to sort of advance issues facing the global south, and infrastructure projects and debt restructuring were very much top of the agenda. Now, this is being seen as a counter to China. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which helped China expand its influence geopolitically and financially across the global south. And what was interesting about this announcement, William, was the fact that President Biden was very much there during the announcement, very much there supporting the countries, because symbolically for the US, this was a chance to reestablish its relationship with Asia Pacific nations and to counter China.
Notably, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin were not present for this summit. Do you have any sense of how their absence affected negotiations?
This actually symbolically gave the US a much bigger stage. President Biden was there, making sure that everybody noticed that the US was there to meet with adversaries and partners and show the US's commitment to the Asia Pacific region. So in many ways, this was a bigger platform for the United States, and sort of made sure that there was no sort of press around President Xi or President Putin, who, by the way, would have commanded a lot of interest had they been present.
For Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, this was obviously a means to showcase his leadership internationally, but also domestically. How was his stewardship of the summit received?
This was a chance for India to really capitalize on the excellent year it has had internationally, becoming the most populous nation, overtaking the UK to becoming the fifth largest economy, landing on the moon. But the way some of the sort of the glitz and the glamour and the pomp and show around G20 and the presidency, that has been criticized. And opposition parties have pointed out that the government is trying to conflate India's success with Prime Minister Modi's success. I mean, you look at the G20 logo, it's the lotus that is the symbol of his political party. You cannot walk 100 meters in Delhi without seeing a G20 poster with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's face on it. And so people are saying this is like an ad campaign months ahead of the general election. And then there's also criticism, William, about the security arrangements. Parts of New Delhi, particularly the main district in which the summit was held, was sort of shut down. So no traffic, no shops, no restaurants. But for millions of people in the city who only get to eat if they work that day, they're daily wage earners, so they are hawkers, they drive people's cars, they deliver food. This was loss of livelihood.
All right, Special Correspondent Pavni Mittal, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.